Whenever I say that I do research in neuroscience of language, people always ask me, but what is it you're doing? I was given a class on the introduction to research. I realized that some of my students were not sure what the research is. Once and for all, let's find out what research is, what do researchers do, and relate all that to the psychological research. Let's get into it. The first important characteristics of research is that it starts with a question. The biggest motivation, that would be basically a problem that you're trying to solve during all of your work. It's a starting point of the study. For example, does sleep affect memory? Does social media increase anxiety? Do bilingual children have better attention than monolingual? In order for the research question to be legit, it has to be first a question, second, it should indicate the problem that you want to solve during your research. You're trying to answer your main question. That could also be translated to a hypothesis, which would be a prediction of the outcome. So if the research question is formulated as a large problem we are trying to solve, a hypothesis would be an expected result. For hypotheses, we usually use the if-then structure. For example, if children sleep more, their memory improves. Or if therapy is effective, anxiety decreases. So you basically say directly where the effect should go. By manipulating one or several variables, what outcomes would change in your behavior. Research is systematic. As I said, it's a frame, so you can just guess the outcome. You can propose a hypothesis, but then in order to claim something, you need to test it. In our case, it includes the experimental setting, so some data or numbers, observations. That would be something that you vary. You eat 3 eggs per day. How does this influence your mood? I'm not sure that it would, but try to test it yourself. The research can involve participants. Those are humans, animals, models, mathematical models, groups. For social psychology, for example, it uses the methods, experimental method, which is more common and easier to explain, but also questionnaires, cognitive tasks, brain imaging. There are various ways to track the behavior, be it more objective, that could be how the brain areas are activated while you're reading angry comments versus very nice ones, or that could be a questionnaire when you are asked directly, implicitly, what you felt during reading those negative comments. Okay, so we have our research question. We formulated the hypothesis or the predicted result. We have collected data in an experimental setting. What do we do next? Now it's time to interpret it. Statistics is a great tool that helps us compare the groups. For example, if we're taking a group of elderly person versus younger person, would we see a difference on attention? For that, we would use the statistical tests, which would be a valid way to compare 2 sets of measures together. And once we're done with the statistics, we have to interpret our results. The interpretation part should take all of the results that you got in your experiments and compare them to the similar experiments in the field. This would first assure that your experimental paradigm is valid and accepted in the field, which doesn't mean that it is correct though, but it could fill in the gap in knowledge. Now, what do they mean by the replication crisis? In the idea of research, it is implicitly suggested that when some research repeat the work of others, they should get the same results. So same study should lead to the same results. In reality, that doesn't happen often. And they say that psychological research, along with social research, is very vulnerable to replications. So even though we're trying to control the setting very much, the final results would eventually be dependent on many tiny decisions of the researchers. Would it be on how to conceptualize the experiment, on how to treat the data, or pre-process, decide which data points are extreme and abnormal and which adjust is needed. And also, of course, in the interpretation, they sometimes call it a cherry picking, when you are picking only the significant results, trying to create a story that is partially fictional. The research is also published in academic journals. In order to do this, you can just submit your paper for it to be reviewed first by your peers, by the colleagues in the field, who decide whether your experimental protocol is fine, whether the conclusions that you're making are valid. Normally 2 or 3 reviewers go through your paper, and at the end they either accept you, more likely they ask you to do some changes, and in some cases they can just reject your publication from the journal. That doesn't mean that you cannot go to another one. This whole idea of research as a systematic way to answer questions using data is an amazing frame that you can apply to real life. I think one of the craziest subjects we can imagine is ourselves. So why don't we start exploring ourselves? Maybe knowing oneself in every tiny detail and understanding what we need from this life is the meaning of it all. I'll leave you here thinking. Cheers!